Anyone fancy war with Russia? Or with China maybe? Or Iran or North Korea? Or all four together? That was the mood music that seemed to be coming out of the Nudge Unit cum PSYOPs department last week when a retiring senior soldier said it was time to mobilise the nation. Our government has already committed us to a new 100 years war to save Ukraine, and the apparent threat of Russia coming our way, moving ever closer to our fields and beaches and landing grounds, disturbed sleeping ghosts. General Peter Sanders, outgoing Chief of the General Staff, spoke about the need for a citizen army that must start getting ready for war, about how Vladimir Putin is a threat to our way of life. Apparently Sweden and Finland are out of the traps faster than us, with their populations already on what Sanders called a war footing. He's invoked World Wars I and II, citing and lamenting national unpreparedness for both. 100 years after the carnage of the Western Front, and here we are again. Your country needs you. It'll be PALS battalions next, white feather emojis for objectors. Except, I suspect, and in this awakening land of ours and in awakening populations elsewhere, it's not just the likes of me saying as much. All is not what it seems. It feels like the latest bid by them upstairs to keep us downstairs perpetually fearful, uncertain and more likely to stop asking questions about other stuff and get back in line. Before you know it, they'll have us digging for victory and putting up Anderson shelters. Except I read last week that growing your own food in the garden is bad for the environment, worse even than farming. Who knew? And the planning department would never let you build an air raid shelter. Downing Street put out a line or two saying the General's remarks, quote, hypothetical scenarios of a future potential conflict, close quote, were not helpful and ruling out plans for conscription. But it all felt a bit good cop, bad cop to me. You go somewhere and say we need a call up to face the beast from the east, scary old Vlad, and then I'll say, hush now, don't you worry your pretty little heads about it. That'll keep them rattled for a bit longer. There's nothing like a perceived threat to our children to focus minds. And the thought of a citizen army, even the mention of conscription, conjures for every parent images of teenaged boys and girls in uniform and marching away. In his speech to an armed vehicles conference on Wednesday, Sanders said, Ukraine brutally illustrates that regular armies start wars, citizen armies win them. The last time I looked, Ukraine was 500,000 down, 500,000 dead, and that Ukrainian citizen army was nowhere near winning anything. Quite the opposite, in fact. More heartbreaking even than footage of row upon row of gravestones bearing photos of young faces are the images that emerged last week, allegedly showing mass graves where the dead lie nameless. But still we send more billions of pounds to keep it going, so that a person must ask what or who we might send next. If you take a breath and pull back from all that's going on in the world, nothing makes sense. For one thing, for the longest time, the message out there has been that Britain, this land of ours, is mostly a basket of deplorables. Those younger generations that spring to mind when anyone mentions a call-up for a citizen army have been invited, all of their lives in the case of the youngest, to believe Britain is a land of white supremacists, of descendants of slave traders, that Britain's imperial past was all about stamping on the faces of indigenous populations around the world. Britain bad. Everywhere else better. Our children's schools and universities filled their heads with notions about how much harm Britain has done, how much harm we're still doing, most recently to the climate with our infernal industry, our gas boilers and the hard-won productivity of the farmers who feed us. And yet now the message is that the time has come to stand up and fight. For what? For king and country. Our children have been taught that our way of life has been the cause of all the trouble in the world. But they're still supposed to fight to defend it. And with what shall they fight? Our steel industry is on its last legs, and for the vast amounts of energy required by the stuff of war, overlooking the fact it takes years and not weeks to tool up for war, will shortly depend only on windmills and solar panels. It makes no sense. No one's born feeling love of country. It's an acquired characteristic, dependent upon what a child is told from the very beginning, first by family and then by the community. Tell children Britain is a land made rich on slavery and the oppression of others, oppression made by war, and you get what we have, generations that would rather be elsewhere. It's also increasingly a world, a Western world at least, where nation-states protected by rigorously maintained and defended national borders are treated as relics of a xenophobic, racist West way past its sell-by date. And instead of encouraging populations from local to national to feel and then take personal responsibility for making decisions affecting their lives, it's about pushing public-private partnerships and stakeholder capitalism, the ambition of the World Economic Forum, towards a world without borders, where people are rootless and without loyalties to place, where all the decisions that matter are made not by them but for them in the boardrooms of transnational banks and corporations. We live in a world where our so-called leaders are signing up to decades-long defence contracts when they're not gathering to discuss, that is, pandemic preparedness, where you have CEOs hand in pocket with world leaders making decisions that are nothing to do with national interests, like the well-being of people, and only about profits for themselves and their stakeholders. If we accept all that, then it's a world full of stockpiles and bullets and missiles in want of wars, endless wars that do no more than make space in the warehouses for more of the same, cha-ching, cha-ching, and more warehouses piled high with vials filled with the latest so-called vaccines, awaiting the orders resultant from the next so-called pandemic determined by Bill Gates' World Health Organization. I say don't fear pandemics, at least nowhere near as much as you should fear pandemic preparedness and the loss of liberty and control of your own life that must inevitably ensue. NATO and the governments of the West told us the war in Ukraine was about defending democracy and nothing at all to do with NATO expansion ever closer to Russia, when demonstrably the opposite is true. Democracy be damned, for fear the pesky people might elect populist politicians, God forbid, instead of bought and paid for progressive stooges. And by now, NATO is 1,000 miles closer to Russia than it was at the end of the Cold War, when the West made solemn promises to keep its hands off the East. Modern war is about making money. Round and round and round it goes. Where it stops, in the same old pockets, that's where, and plenty more where that came from. Are you ready? Are your children ready to fight not for freedom, for hearth and home, for kith and kin, but to secure the revenue streams of corporations like BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street? In a global machine of so many mindlessly spinning cogs, our children might be rendered into minced meat. They're burning our money right before our eyes, urinating down our backs while telling us it's raining, while people at home can't afford to heat their homes and the English Channel is no obstacle but a bridge. Thousands of people are on the move in our direction, many from those countries we've been busy dropping bombs on for decades, many of those incomers of unknown identity and intent. I'm all for efforts to defend our country, but in many ways that effort is like the maintenance of a house. Before adding to it, contemplating extensions and better Wi-Fi, the job starts with making the structure wind and watertight, and for years our house has leaked like the proverbial sieve. Now one of our most senior soldiers says we need more soldiers when we don't even look after those we have. Our government has no respect for veterans. That's true here and in the United States of America. Newcomers to the UK are housed in 4-star hotels, and many of them in accommodation built for our fighting men and women, while countless numbers of our veterans, many struggling with all the consequences of military service, wounds, physical and mental, PTSD, are homeless and ignored on the streets they gave so much to defend. Across the pond, the southern border is non-existent. Millions are bussed into states already groaning under the weight of new arrivals. Whole new towns are being built to house them. The Democrats say it's democracy itself that's on the ballot in the United States, but much like the democracy we're all supposedly fighting for in Ukraine, back home those Democrats are doing their very best to strike their strongest opponent off the ballot altogether, if not to throw him in jail. Try explaining that kind of democracy to the 70-odd million Americans who voted for Donald J. Trump last time, and those who've already given him their landslide backing in Iowa and New Hampshire. But with Trump having already won primaries there, what on earth will his opponents do next? Here's the thing. Ours is now a land led by those with no respect for place, for the past. Quite the opposite. They've no respect or concern for life either, anti-human as their agenda plainly is. It's all blatantly displayed in the lessons taught to our children. It's there in the shaming disregard for the well-being of those who have already stood up to don the uniform and fight for country. back to where I began. I don't believe for a minute our leaders have conscription in mind, not yet at least, but I firmly believe the objective is to keep the population on edge, constantly anxious about what's coming next. It's plain to see they've arrived at what they think is a winning formula. Fear of disease, engineered shortage of money, deliberate shortage of reliable, affordable energy, existential fear of the end of the world and wars without end. The antidote to the fear is knowledge. Know that the key players in a world of technology they control, of censorship of dissent, of control of our money, energy and food, it's all and only about wealth and the power wealth confers. And the most lucrative game any of them can think of is war. The only war worth fighting now is the war we must all fight against the fear and those who sell it.